from Toronto in Canada. David, thank you so much for joining us on The Globe. Now, can South Africa play a catalyst role in entrenching intra-Africa trade?
Well, absolutely. Of course, South Africa is the most industrialized economy on the continent. It's a country that has a well-developed banking system. So there is no question. And of course, it's a country that has the biggest manufacturing capability on the continent. So what is needed, South Africa has. The problem, though, is that it cannot be one way. In order for inter-Africa trade to be realized, we must. I think I have about 3 problems that need to be addressed. If I can share them.
Yes, please go ahead. Share those programs that you speak of.
Yes, to me, the biggest problem, the main hindrance, the main factor that limits the trade on the continent, which in your program you said that somebody said that 15% of trade is inter-Africa, which is very low. So one of the problems, of course, is political, the leadership. We still have like a lack of political will to commit to agreements that can free trade across borders. You have, of course, long-term political leaders that have been there for 30 years. You have some conflict areas. And then you have also small trading blocks within each region that are still stuck in there. So that I would say political will is number 1 challenge we face. Then problem number 2 is that in order for inter-Africa trade to happen, we have these African economies have to have things to trade. Very often they don't really have much to trade. They do very limited value adding. So even though we have a very developed economy in South Africa, it would have to trade with others. So manufacturing would have to develop on the rest of the continent. Problem number 3 is infrastructure. In order to trade, you need roads, you need railways, you need air connectivity. All these are serious challenges. You still have railways. Where the railways are, they're still old, built in the colonial period. The road network, even within each sub-region. You can imagine, something coming from Johannesburg to, say, Bujumbura in Central Africa. It is hardly, it's going to be a challenge.
Now,
but having said all that, this is the time for Africa to really walk the talk. Because since independence in the 60s, this has been the talk. So this is the time to do it.
Now, David, in terms of the time for doing it, this is the time for action. What needs to be done first? In terms, you mentioned infrastructure being a huge, major stumbling block. You mentioned political will. You know, in terms of this conflict in some countries within the different regions on the African continent. How do we work around those stumbling blocks to ensure that there is a way going forward? As we heard and saw former Nigeria's President Olusegun Obasanjo speaking of the fact that some raw material is taken from the African continent, and a lot of developed economies are making more money from those raw materials by turning them or manufacturing them into very expensive product. For instance, I can put as an example diamonds, for instance, or gold. So how do we work around these stumbling blocks to ensure that the political will is there, issues of infrastructure is rectified, and there's development on the African continent for intra-African trade to work?
No, thank you for that question. Really wonderful question. Well, begin with Nigeria, where Obasanjo comes from, where he was, after all, the president. There you have petroleum. Exported, and of course, petroleum companies make trillions of dollars. And yet, there is no processing of petroleum even in a place like Nigeria. So we have the continent then exports petroleum only to import it more expensively, which is very absurd. So the problem again begins with the political leadership of the continent. This is the time that perhaps new leaders like Cyril Ramaphosa and others who can really commit to agreeing and implementing. The problem with us in Africa is that we talk. Like now, there was this meeting that agreed on this continental Africa free trade. So now, I hate to tell you this, but 1 year will pass, and hardly any of those 58 countries will have signed on. Already, 3-4 months have passed. If my memory serves me right, only 3 so far have signed off. So political will, you see, Lulu, things like infrastructure. Infrastructure can be built. Infrastructure can be built. Manufacturing can be built. So, but the political will is what is hard. You know, you can't impose leaders that are not there. That is where the problem lies.
Now, David, very quickly, we are running out of time, but just in wrapping up, the African Export-Import Bank and the Export Credit Insurance Corporation of South Africa have signed an MOU to launch a $1 billion US financing program, and this is to promote and expand investment, you know, between South Africa and the rest of Africa. Is Africa prepared for this kind of venture? Just also bearing in mind that we touched on the issues of infrastructure, and you just mentioned that that can be developed. Political will, there seemingly is some sort of a positive, you know, draws in terms of leaders coming together. What needs to be done?
I think that I go back to the question of leadership. Cyril Ramaphosa and you know, let me put it this way. The big boys and girls, the bigger economies, if we can get leadership from South Africa, if we can get leadership, so which is a leader in Southern Africa, if we can get Nigeria to come on board, a leader in Western Africa, if we can get Kenya in Eastern Africa, a leader in Eastern Africa. If those can drive and persuade other leaders to follow suit and really commit, the rest will follow. I have no doubt whatsoever.
David, thank you so much for joining us. We'll leave it there for now. That is political economist David Hiramba joining us via Skype from Toronto in Canada.